Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the gang's all here as the original cast of Jurassic Park meet the cast of Jurassic World for one last dino stampede in Jurassic World Dominion. Following the events of Fallen Kingdom, dinosaurs are roaming freely around the world. Owen Grady and Claire Dearing, played by Chris Pratt and Bryce Howard respectively, are living in secret with Maisie Lockwood, the world's first cloned human, played by Isabella Sermon. When Maisie is kidnapped along with Beta, the baby of Velociraptor Blue, Owen and Claire race to rescue them both. Meanwhile, Ellie Sattler, played by Laura Dern, is investigating bioengineered locusts that are devouring crops, re-teamed with Sam Neill's Alan Grant, and with the aid of Jeff Goldblum's Ian Malcolm, gets access to the dinosaur sanctuary run by Biosyn and their CEO, Lewis Dodgson, played by Campbell Scott, hoping to prove that they have created the locusts. It's been almost 30 years since the original Jurassic Park, based on the book by Michael Crichton, wowed audiences the world over with its then cutting-edge CGI effects that made them believe that dinosaurs had been brought back to life, and combine that with Steven Spielberg's master filmmaking. That movie still holds up to this day, even though the effects are now starting to show their age somewhat, because Spielberg knows how to craft that kind of blockbuster spectacle. He knows how to craft a movie with excitement and tension and just sheer adventure. Very few can match him at it. And it also casts a long shadow over the movies that followed. Jurassic Park had two immediate sequels, but they were very much the case of diminishing returns, although I do have to admit, I have a slight soft spot for the third movie over the second one. I know that's not really a very accepted opinion, but the series lay dormant for a long time until Colin Trevorrow rebooted it in 2015 with Jurassic World. And like Dr. Malcolm in this movie, I'll just simply say it, not really a fan of Jurassic World, and that's largely because I felt that Jurassic World was a cynical retread of the original film that had a very strangely mean-spirited quality about it, and that's kind of carried on through this new trilogy of films. Although, I do have to admit one thing about Jurassic World: at least it wasn't Fallen Kingdom. You might recall that I actually reviewed Fallen Kingdom when it came out, and I gave it an absolute slating, and I stand by that. Even though I got a lot of negative responses about it, I stand by what I said in that review. I thought that movie was absolutely dreadful. I thought it was one of the worst modern blockbusters in the last 10 years. So now we have Jurassic World Dominion, billed as being the epic conclusion to the Jurassic saga, bringing back not only the Jurassic World cast, but also the original Jurassic Park cast, and putting them in the same movie together to fire upon that nostalgia that the series has already been leaning on far too much in these recent outings. But nevertheless, I do have to concede that Dominion is an improvement on its immediate predecessor. It's not as bad as Fallen Kingdom. But that more just says how bad that movie was, because Dominion isn't really all that good either. So you might recall that Fallen Kingdom ended on a bit of a cliffhanger of dinosaurs being released out into the world. Let's try not to remember the very stupid reasons for why that happened, but even so, it essentially made the title literal. Man and dinosaur will be forced to share the same planet once again, and the consequences of that. And if you don't remember it, don't worry, the movie's got you covered, because it opens with an absolutely enormous expository dump recap of the previous 6 films, provided by a Now This piece, which basically goes on for way too long, and also doesn't really give the audience very much credit for remembering what happened in these films. Fallen Kingdom's entire reason for existence was basically going, okay, we know that the Jurassic Park movies have kind of been following this formula and it's been a bit of a retread, so we're blowing up the park. We can't do that anymore. We're going to be completely new. That's our promise. And then Jurassic World Dominion decides it's going to very quickly go back on that, not least of which because most of the movie is set in a dinosaur sanctuary. That's basically another word for a park. The movie opens where the last film left off for about 5 minutes or so. I particularly like the reintroduction to Owen in this movie, where essentially he's a dinosaur cowboy. Like, that's a kind of neat idea, but you get a couple of scenes at the top of the movie that address this, but otherwise, that very quickly falls into the background. Given the opportunity to do something completely fresh, Trevorrow, who has returned for this outing in the director's chair, has basically gone, I don't know what to do with that, I'm just going to do the same thing over again. Which is not exactly a great vote of confidence. So aside from little details like a dinosaur black market, there really isn't that much payoff for the setup from the previous movie, which is quite astonishing. You would think it would have huge consequences, but in actual fact, it has so little effect on the plot of this movie that it could have been left out entirely. In fact, by the time that we pick up events in this film, it feels like the world is already adapted to this fact, that everyone just kind of accepts that dinosaurs are a thing, and it doesn't seem to be disrupting anything, which probably makes you wonder, well, what is this movie actually about then? I'll tell you what it's about. It's about locusts. Very curiously, what Trevorrow has decided to centre this Jurassic World sequel around is a story about genetically engineered locusts that are just ravaging through crops. That is what's causing the ecological disaster in this movie, not the fact that man is sharing the world with dinosaurs. That's almost entirely incidental to the proceedings. It's the dirty work of a company called Biosyn, the name coming from the original Crichton Jurassic Park books, but is yet another stand-in for InGen, essentially, in that it's a company that's doing a lot of bioengineering and science in that regard, but also trying to take care of the dinosaurs at this sanctuary. And it's the work of the CEO, Lewis Dodgson. If that name sounds a little bit familiar, then you've probably seen the original Jurassic Park far too many times. Dodgson, you might recall, was the guy that gave Nedry that shaving can. Of course, the whole point of that character was essentially he was a very forgettable lackey, to the point where they even made a point of that. See, nobody cares. And guess what? The movie does a fantastic job of still not making you care. For some reason, they've decided to bring this character back, presumably because they wanted a major deep-cut callback to the original to try and tie things together in some way, make it seem like there's a big grand plan. Incidentally, the shaving can is back in this film. He just has that. I don't know why he has that, because presumably that was on Isla Nublar when Nedry got killed in that movie and it fell into the mud. Regardless, I probably wouldn't have brought this character back because hardly anyone remembers them in the first place, and also because the actor that played him in the original Jurassic Park is currently jailed for being a predator, so I probably wouldn't have called too much attention to that. He's now played by Campbell Scott, and essentially he plays him as this kind of Steve Jobsy type who's got a vision of the future, even if that vision makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. They are working on bioengineering programs, so obviously people will be able to work out that these locusts that have Cretaceous DNA in them might have come from the same place that houses all the dinosaurs and works on them, and also because it's literally leaving behind their crops. It tells you exactly who did it right there. And not only does it not work within the world of the movie itself, it also doesn't work as metaphor, because the whole thing is clearly meant to be an allegory for climate change. The locusts are meant to be a stand-in for a man-made disaster that is ruining the planet. And the Jurassic Park films have always been about this. It's always been about man's relationship with science and potentially going too far and causing our own extinction. It's just that Dominion makes this overt text this time out. It's just that in terms of being analogous to reality, the way the film handles this particular plot, it just doesn't work, because climate change is a very nuanced and complex issue. It's going to take a lot of factors to try and rectify it, whereas the locusts are very much a problem to be solved in this movie, but once we find that, we know how to take care of it. It's just too neat and tidy if it's trying to be an overt commentary on this particular subject. It's one of many underdeveloped ideas that just crowd up this movie because it's trying to do too much simultaneously. This is trying to wrap up up 6 films at once, so obviously there is going to be a lot of baggage, but the movie definitely doesn't help itself in that regard, because virtually every major character in a Jurassic World movie that hasn't been eaten yet is brought back in this movie in some form. So Justice Smith has a couple of scenes in the first act, Omar C comes back in the middle in Malta, but those characters have very little to do with the proceedings. You could have easily completely written them out, and the film has so many characters in it that honestly, it needs a good trimming of the herd. It needs quite a few characters just being picked off, just to thin out the ranks a little bit, but it just keeps piling on the callbacks to earlier characters, and it assumes that you have a relationship with them because they were in a previous movie. We don't have the connection to these characters to justify bringing them back just for the sake of it. Speaking of baggage from the Jurassic World movies, a surprising amount of the film's plot centres around the character of Maisie, who you might recall was revealed in the previous film as being a clone, and this whole character and subplot, the Lockwoods thing that they've retconned onto the storyline of the previous films, it felt completely wrong in Fallen Kingdom. It still feels wrong here, the way they try and connect back all the way to the original film, like, oh, suddenly 5 movies in, John Hammond had a friend that he didn't talk about that was exactly like him and was also into bioengineering and had a clone, and all this stuff just adds unnecessary bloat and complication to the movie, especially because it assumes that the audience cares about this stuff when we really don't, and the movie tries to force you, because they even get the original cast to kind of play along with this stuff, like, oh, I kind of remember who this person was and so on and so forth, but no, it feels completely inorganic. It feels like it has no place, no business being in this movie, not least of which because it's not what the audience wants to see. Naturally, Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard are brought back once again, but because there's so much going on in this movie, it affords very little time for them, especially in terms of characterization. Howard actually gets a bit more the focus this time out. It seems like more the major set pieces centre around her character, whereas Chris Pratt actually falls surprisingly into the background. He's less of a focus this time out, and Owen has really degenerated as a character. He wasn't great to begin with, he was just a cocky, obnoxious guy, but now at this point, he's just an invincible action hero. He's just going around from set piece to set piece, and Pratt just seems like he's completely on autopilot here. He's not really doing all that much in the proceedings, nor is he livening things up with quips. He's just kind of going through the motions. Speaking of motions, one thing that really gets pushed beyond belief in this movie is the whole thing of Owen training raptors, and he's doing the hand gesture like, stop, stop. And then other characters now start doing it in this movie. Virtually everyone is just going up to velociraptors going, stop it, like a naughty puppy. It's ridiculous. It comes into being a farce. And the whole thing about Blue in this movie, that's meant to be a major subplot, but it disappears so long out of the movie that genuinely, about 2 hours into it, when it suddenly remembers that plot, it took me by surprise. Like, oh yeah, this movie does have to wrap up that particular element as well. That's because there's so much going on, you can't even keep track of all the nonsense that's happening simultaneously. I am pleased to report that Laura Dern, Sam Neill and Jeff Goldblum do actually get substantial roles in this movie. It's not like Goldblum's appearance in Fallen Kingdom, which is basically a glorified cameo to be cut into the trailer. Here, they actually serve a purpose, and a lot of time is spent on these characters, and it's nice to be in their company once again. It's great to see them just working off of each other, especially because they haven't been reunited all at once since the first movie, and that is what audiences would like to see. It's something that the Star Wars trilogy really mucked up by not having Luke, Han and Leia in the same space in their new trilogy, and having those characters interact with each other and putting them at the forefront is a really nice move. I enjoyed their plots more actually than Howard and Pratt's side of the plot, and the movie essentially runs those two storylines in parallel. It basically cuts between them for extended chunks of time, And that is also probably one of the deficits. It actually felt to me like two kind of lackluster sequels happening simultaneously that eventually converge in the third act, but boy did it take its sweet time getting there. I think that is the reason why the movie feels so long. It's 2.5 hours. It is by far and away the longest Jurassic Park film, and it feels it. It's because there is so much time devoted to these plots. It feels like at least 15 to 20 minutes passes in one plot, and then you have to spend another 15 to 20 minutes in the B plot. So essentially the movie keeps flip-flopping between two sets of protagonists and never really finding a clear rhythm. It doesn't help that the script is very stilted, to say the least. It is really rough in terms of the dialogue. In fact, there is a drinking game you can play with this movie. Count how many times characters say, "Oh, hey, I know you, your full name of character." This goes right down to when Ellie and Grant first interact with each other. These two have been friends for the best part of 30 years, and they walk into a tent going, "Dr. Grant, Dr. Ellie Sattler." Like, yeah, I know who you are. I've been friends with you for literally decades. That's a very normal thing for people to do. And people seem to just know each other, just randomly. Like, "Oh, I just know you because I've heard about Jurassic World," and things like that. It's very awfully convenient. And speaking of convenient, there's a lot of moments in the plot where things just kind of happen because the story needs them to. Owen and Claire, they land in Malta and they're looking for Maisie, and almost virtually the first person they encounter has seen Maisie and was involved in her kidnapping in some way. That's really awfully convenient. And this culminates in the third act where virtually everyone is going, "Oh, hey, I know you. Oh, hey, I know you." It's like, yes, we know. Is there some way of introducing these characters where you don't read out your entire character biography at once? But in addition to all these recurring characters, and I haven't even mentioned BD Wong's Dr. Wu yet, who apparently still hasn't learned his lesson from messing with genetics, the film still feels the need to add a whole host of new characters on top of it, most of whom don't make any impression because they're completely secondary. But there is one notable exception to that, and that is DeWanda Wise. She is definitely the standout in this movie. She's kind of playing this Han Solo-y type. She's this pilot that works for the highest bidder, but has a kind of crisis of conscience. She's actually got a good heart inside of her, and she tags along with Owen and Claire later on in the movie. Her character is really distinct and very memorable in the proceedings, and actually, I found myself more interested in her than most of the recurring characters. Wise actually makes her seem cool. She actually has a presence about her. If it crafted more characters like this, I would have actually cared about them in most of the action scenes. The problem is that it hasn't. Which brings me to the dinosaurs in this movie, which actually feel remarkably secondary. One of the great things about the original Jurassic Park is that Spielberg made you feel a sense of wonder and majesty at seeing these creatures brought back to life. There is an awe about it, a magic, and there's precious little of that in the Jurassic World films, and in its place we have cynicism. And I know it's hard to keep up over 6 films, and it isn't entirely for a lack of trying, at least not on a technical level. One of the things that Jurassic World can be commended for is combining CGI with on-set animatronics, like the original films did, very much keeping in the same tradition. The problem is in the use of it in the story, or rather lack thereof, because after a certain point, especially in the second half, it doesn't feel like there's so much of a plot, so much as just a succession of set pieces and dino chases over and over again. Essentially, it just becomes one long mush of dino attacks. It becomes quite repetitive and also very mechanical. We know that the good guys are not going to get eaten by the dinosaurs, and the bad guys almost certainly are at one point or another. There's no attempt to kind of shake up that status quo. There's no attempt to have maybe one of the recurring characters suddenly and unexpectedly get killed off, to remind you that these are genuine potential threats. Whereas because we know that they're never in danger, it just calls attention to the fact that the set pieces, they have a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of dramatic effects, but none of it actually connects to the audience. It feels like Trevorrow stages a lot of this with a kind of shrug. At times, the apathy kind of just borders into incompetence. One sequence in particular got my attention for all the wrong reasons, which is a plane crash. Now, earlier on in the movie, the film establishes the sanctuary in the Dolomite Mountains via a very long establishing shot. So we have the mountains, an icy dam, and then a green wooded area, and finally the sanctuary. It's very clear it's in that particular order. Later on, a plane is flying over the mountains, it gets attacked, one of the occupants ejects out. Somehow, the plane, even though it hurtles past her, continuing on its descent, the ejectee manages to land in a wooded area in front of the mountains where the plane crashes into the icy dam. That is impossible. That makes geographically no sense and completely violates what the film has set up. It is absolutely careless on a directing front, and it just hopes that the audience won't actually bother to remember that. Later on in the movie, it just feels like Trevorrow is just going through the motions. He's just doing the Jurassic Park stuff because we expect it. And the Gigantosaurus, who is meant to be the new big star dinosaur of this movie, one that Trevorrow inexplicably compared to the Joker in interviews, is barely even in the film. It's in it for about 5 minutes. It might be in this film less than the T-Rex was in the original Jurassic Park. It hardly makes any impact until it shows up at the climax, and again, it just feels like an element that's in this movie because it's a Jurassic Park film, we need a new dinosaur in it. Why does it need to be there? I don't know, have a big fight scene at the end of it. It just feels like the franchise has run out of ideas. Again, this is an improvement on Fallen Kingdom, but that movie was filled with action sequences that should have easily killed the characters several times over, and more holes in the plot than a sieve, whereas this, it probably has an equal amount of plot holes, but at least the action sequences aren't completely insulting to someone with eyes and a brain. It just goes to show how to not do a legacy sequel. The whole Jurassic World franchise has treaded water entirely on Spielberg's legacy, just taking imagery from the original film and hoping that that nostalgia would carry it through, whereas something like Top Gun Maverick shows how you do this kind of movie where you pay homage to the past and do something new with it simultaneously that feels satisfying. It's nice that they brought back the original cast, and that definitely brings some charge to the proceedings, but it's too little, and it doesn't resolve major problems with the film, like the fact that it's so filled with weird decisions, or just filled with too much in general. And even the ending of this supposed epic conclusion, it really feels like a shrug. It's such an anti-climax, and it's weird for a movie as gargantuan as this one. The way this series started with this huge roar, and in this sixth film, it just ends with a whimper. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's brand new Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can take a bite at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.